and City Commissioner Sarah Sprinkle. And also we have a bunch of city staff here that we'll talk about in a little bit, as Mauricio Mazza from Hunt & Brady Architects, the local architect here in Orlando that's working with the design team, will introduce other people. What we're going to do, folks, is I will introduce Mauricio. Mauricio is then going to introduce the design team. Sir David will take over and present the concept to us. To try to keep this under control a bit, what we have is everybody have yellow cards. Do you have yellow cards? Did you get them? If you don't have them and you'd like to have a comment addressed by the design team, please raise your hand. They're white cards. I'm sorry. There was a change. They were yellow not too long ago. So if you don't have them, please raise your hand and we'll have one handed to you. During the course of the evening, if you would fill those out, and when you're done with your question and comments, just hold it up. Someone will take it from you, and those will be brought forward. Once the design team is done presenting, we'll talk through those. We'll present the opportunity for the City Commission to first ask questions of the architect and the entire team. This is our first opportunity to sit together and talk about this, so we're going to allow that. We're going to try to keep that short because we really want to hear from you all. Then what we'll do is we'll read through those yellow cards. We'll try to quiz David on everything he knows about Winter Park during that time. And then what we'll do is if there is time, we will have the opportunity for open mic at the end of the night. But we have a hard stop at 7:30. There are planes to be caught. So with that, I will turn over the microphone to Mauricio.
Thank you, Mayor Leary. On behalf of Hunt Brady Architects and Adjaye Associates, we'd like to thank you for coming out this evening, great turnout, and to participate in this very exciting project. We'd like to start by thanking some of the stakeholders and the people that have participated on the design so far, and that will continue working on the design. First of all, the members of the community that provided us with valuable information and feedback on the meeting that we had right here in this room on June 20th. Thank you all so much. I'd like to thank city officials, planning, zoning, building departments, city commissioners, Mayor Leary, the task force members for this project, library staff and members of the library board. We also met with the Public Art Advisory Board, Parks and Recreation, and they're the ones that handle the event center as well. And then Pizzuti Solutions, they're the owner's rep for the city of Winter Park. And lastly, I'd like to thank the members of our design team, Adjaye Associates, all the Hunt Brady folks that have worked on the project and will work on the project, TLC engineers for mechanical, electrical, fire protection, land design, civil and landscape architecture, and lastly, Brasfield and Gorey. They've been providing us with pre-construction cost estimates. They've been very helpful. All right, so before we address the concept design, I'd like to take you through the timeline for the project. As you can see in this chart, starting from the left up on top, we have completed programming. We've identified all of the pieces of the puzzle, the space allocations for both the event center and the library. That was completed and approved July 20th. And that gave us enough information to start with conceptual design, which we are finishing up today. After we get feedback today, we're going to complete our what we call schematic design, which is the first of 3 phases of design. The next one would be design development, which would complete March of 18th. And construction documents, these are the final documents that include drawings and specifications in July of 18. Then we go into permitting and bidding, which we anticipate taking a few months, and that will take us to about November of 18th when construction can start, and allowing for about 15, 16 months of construction. That should put us in the spring of 2020 for final completion. So that's sort of a brief outline of the schedule, and at this point, I'd like to pass it on to Russell Crater with Adjaye and Associates. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Just to speak briefly about where we've been and where we are is, as Maurizio just spoke about, we just finished the programming aspect in the summer. We were here in June, meeting with you all here, and we also met with the user groups and task force for the library and event center. We used that time as a moment of learning, as a moment of listening. We'd also attended, I think, about a year ago, part of the Aspen Institute's participation here in Winter Park, and really try to grasp what the community was asking for out of the library. And so with that, in this last programming phase that was primarily over the summer, as a result of listening, many of the spaces then were pulled out. And we were doing this listening without design at this time. It was just, we knew the site, and we started to develop what it was that the library in the future was going to be, as well as how the event center has an interaction. And so what you're seeing here is just, I recognize the text is rather small. But I think what's most important maybe to look at this is that you see that we're still focused on the library. The event center is kind of shaded in the pink hues there, and then with the more saturation of the primary colors, you can see the library services. And so through this, it became that question of what are those spaces and what are those adjacencies? One of the things we started to pick out is, I'm pointing to this green spot, and that kind of is really well developed out of the Aspen Institute meetings, and we're calling it Patron Support, and that's actually the support, the supporting areas of the library that are not necessarily the collection of the books. It's not necessarily a study room. It's not necessarily a book handler. It's really more about the interaction of having a space to take on, to own, to take ownership from the public. And so you can see here we're trying to, in this just adjacency diagram, these are just little diagrams we use to start to think about what Blvd belongs next to the other. It's not necessarily spatial defining architecture. It's just saying this is next to this, and we'd like to pursue this adjacency. So you're seeing the green, and this is primarily the library. And what we're starting to see is, like, we want to make this, if I could say, a spider web, or these connection points to the event center, and start to make these two correlate. And so it's basically, you can see the banquet hall here, which is 300 seat. You can see the administration, the books, the meeting rooms, the study rooms, the history, the Winter Park history, and the material handling. And so it's all kind of centralized around what we're calling the green zone, but it's the patron services. Sorry. So here you are, and this is kind of the bigger diagram for us, that the overarching principle is that you can see the library and the event center, and then it became a question for us to explore, is about what is that zone in between. I know that there have been discussions about how do these two interact, are they one, are they two? And so what we started to uncover was that we actually have these zones which start to mean more than just part of the library or part of the Civic Center. And so that is where we started our exploration and left off to move into concept design. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to David.
Thank you. That's Russell Crater, who's the director working on this project and has been working closely with me for more than a decade. We have been making libraries in different parts of the country, so you have one of my best guys here on the ground. It's important that you see those adjacencies. It's not important to see the details, but in a way that's what's informed the way in which the concept for the building has evolved. We've understood the history of the library in your community from the sort of early beginnings, 1902, to 1979, and you can see the trajectory. Sort of the house grew up and became the building that it is, sort of post-war, late sort of mid-20th century, and then where we are going now at the beginning of the 21st century. Where is it? Oh, there. I should point that way. We know that we're in an extraordinary climate. These are postcards, but really very beautiful inspirations for me in the studio. The canals of the city, the idea of being near water bodies, maybe even going out to the beach. This area, this part of Florida, is a really sort of unique geography and ecology, and it's something that we're really inspired by. It has extraordinary flora and fauna. Some of the flora and fauna that I'm inspired by are the incredible ferns and palms that are in this region, and the way in which they have a kind of structural economy. What I mean by that is an ability to perform and do what they need to do with, creating synthesis with these extraordinary geometries and shapes. I think that became very powerful sort of inspiration as I started to study how we were going to make the program parts that Russell just described into a set of buildings. And of course, we also understand the vernacular of the city and how it's grown. The importance of some of the early buildings and the lessons about creating datums, podiums, creating shaded spaces, and then the volumes, and that being the architecture of the city very much in its beginnings, and the roots and sort of DNA of that still permeating through the city as it evolves and as it becomes more and more modern. But we were very interested in going back and looking at this, what I call the kind of hierarchy of architecture in this region. And for us, the summary is not really about the sort of following it literally, but to understand its principles. This idea of creating a datum, dealing with the ground plane and its varying scenarios, creating a kind of space of public, and then creating the inhabitation or the use. And in a way, I think that's a way to understand what we're trying to do now in the 21st century, that we don't want to lose those lessons because that's hardwired in your collective memory. But we want to also use that to become the springboard to make a contemporary, very contemporary building. We also even looked at the civic and ecclesiastical buildings in the region, and the sort of structural excellence, what I call structural excellence. What I mean by that is the incredible engineering in stone and masonry to create colonnades and arches in the monasteries and churches. That is part of the history that you have here. And the modern movement, the 20th century, and the explosion of different architectures from Frank Lloyd Wright through to Paul Rudolph, the idea of shade, structural expression, sculptural form, are all part of the landscape. That's part of the history of your built environment. With that, the thinking really, when I started to work, and this is really probably the most important sketch of a series of sketches that went through thinking about this, was that I felt that maybe we definitely needed to acknowledge the two parts, the buildings as these forms, but to find a unifying system. So in a way, they're an agglomeration of systems. So from arrival to the library to the event center are almost variations, almost in the way that plants make variations of the same kind of motif. It's a sort of flowering of three forms that sort of create the landscape for this new community space and creates the stage for the buildings to inhabit their position in the park. And in a way, by sort of settling on that, I wanted to do exactly in a way the palms for me are sort of powerful. I wanted the forms not just to be just shapes, but to actually perform environmentally, to perform in terms of creating shade, the agglomeration of buildings to create, the necessary comfort in terms of light and shade, in terms of protecting against prevailing winds, cold winds, and allowing warm winds, summer winds to be part of the way in which the building makes its settlement, and in a way to kind of make a community cluster. It's almost like a sort of a series of buildings, like a little village of edification for the community at that spot. One of the things that became very important was this idea of acknowledging that the site is a park and it is moving. And, you know, a wonderful kind of neoclassical concept is to, in these kind of moments, is to create a datum. You know, all classical buildings really sit on a podium. All buildings about civic life really have this idea of making something that you place the forms on and it registers to the community that this is a space for everyone. You know, depending on which part of the city you come from, which community you come from, this site becomes a space with its podium that is for everyone and collects everyone into their different uses. And that also seems very important, that it wasn't just an object building, but in a way we were making a table, a space for visibility of the community to enjoy this wonderful asset of this park and to enjoy what libraries and event centers do, which is to bring our communities together and to edify generations, both young and old. Obviously the site, you know, I don't need to tell you about your city, but Morse Blvd is here, and this is our park. And the orange is really the site that we're sort of working with. And between the sort of two main lakes, we sort of have this sort of Martin Luther King Jr. Park, and that is next to the sort of the sort of what I'm calling three bodies of water. And that was interesting to me because in a way with the forms that we were trying to evoke were about making three forms, and I like the idea that the three bodies of water and the three forms kind of have a kind of relationship. One is a kind of natural made thing, and the other one is a kind of architectural form. This is a drone shot of that view. This is the existing building. We're looking from the water back, so this is Morse Blvd, and this is really the site and understanding the potential of the site and its relationship to the sort of lakes and the bodies. Being just a little bit elevated allows you to really see something more than you would ordinarily understand. So taking that overview, there's Morse Blvd here, we sought to create and understand the park as a network of systems that really enhance the community's life. Existing at the moment are the sports grounds, and then obviously they're the family grounds, and it makes sense that learning the mind is part of this network. So it's really the body, the mind, and the family around these three bodies of water, creating this central network. How we sort of do it is to create a plinth that touches the water, comes right to the form, and allows us to create different access points onto what I'm calling the community table, and then allows different things to spill off it, and to create the network of paths to use this position, and I'll also talk a little bit more about what this kind of offers. But that becomes the staging point, and then parking, short-term parking and long-term parking are sort of surrounding that form and in the landscape of that form. So in terms of parking, this is the sort of long-term parking on this side, and the short-term parking coming through a first pavilion, I'll call them pavilions, which sort of is a drop-off pavilion, and then short-term parking and out, or services being able to come through. And of course, in terms of event spaces, the incredible amount of parking that's around the site supports many things happening here and allows us to not just rely on the immediate parking on the grounds. I talked about this family of forms that are similar, and in a way, you start with the carport, but you have then the two volumes, the library and the event center. And they are sort of almost placed as a still life on a table, and they orientate themselves to the water body. So there's sort of 1, 2, 3 are sort of, the forms are sort of set up to kind of acknowledge that, the center taking the middle view, and they crank to sort of create a sort of armed sort of opening, which is really the public main thrust through the project, framing the water bodies, and creating a sort of void between the architecture. So the first invitation is, come to this incredible spot and look at this beautiful view, and then the two buildings are adjacent to you. So you come through that center, and then the two buildings left and right, and the void is the landscape. Acknowledging that the landscape is the primary thing here. Keep doing that. This is not a real section, but just to show that what I want to do is to see if those three geometries can do more, as I said, than just be shapes. So I want to see if we can work with the geometry to deform, twist, mold, so that we're getting shade and we're getting canopy out of the geometry of the skin of the building. So the inhabitation is one thing, but the skin of the building is really, there's complex compound curves, possibly, that actually do more than just be the skin of the enclosure of the building, but allows for solar shading, for allowing the winter sun to come right through into the building, and to also create shade from the rain. These are just giving you some sort of slightly technical but important overviews. The cluster creates a winter sort of condition where shade is the orange. So really, the Belvedere becomes really a really beautiful spot in the winter months, but also in the summer months, the building areas around the clusters are in shade, and reveal the sort of the plinth as the place for the community. This is just looking at that in terms of just light and shadow. That in the winter, the important sunlight is really hitting the elevation of the building, hitting the plaza, and then in the summer, it's really the building is in shade because of the high sun. So the form creates shading around the entire building naturally. We also thought very much about rain. We wanted to keep these forms pure, so we've worked out so that the geometry allows you to arrive and to be able to go right around the buildings in the dry. So the geometry creates its own kind of sort of geometry. You don't need a kind of special canopy. It's this kind of, the geometry is creating the enclosure that creates the shade. So it's a large overhanging roof, which is a tropical idea, but that's folded into the skin. So in a way, the skin and this idea of canopy are folded into one form. And that's some of the things that we're going to be testing in the next stages, exactly how that geometry is working. But that, we think, is the sort of engineering excellence and the form that we're very excited to pursue. And of course, as I said earlier, the cluster together creates a buffer to the winter winds. So when you're on the Belvedere, you really get the summer winds, the warm summer winds, and you get the aspect where you need it, and it's protected where you need it. Let's go into the building. The thinking is that you are dropped off, you come into that center, you come through that void, and you have that sort of patrons area that Russ was talking about as part of the arrival entrance space. But you come in and are actually set up into a main hall where the main circulation is absolutely central and splits the plan into a cross plan where you have very clear legibility about the different parts of the building. So you have teenagers, you have back of house support, you have history, the history collection space, you have the auditorium where possibly the TED Talks could be happening, where children's teaching can happen, where adult teaching can happen, where seminars can happen as an open space, a folded space. And then you have the sort of perimeter where you have the patron spaces. And then up above, you have children's library and general sort of library spaces, and then you have support behind it. And that's really seen as a volume that's not going full width, but something which is actually in the primary volume. Something that comes out of creating these three forms is that, in a way, I'm trying to see if we can make an architecture like an incredible hall rather than a series of rooms, where the legibility of the building is very clear, and that the different parts can also change very easily without reducing or compromising the legibility of the building, that it can evolve. And the building can grow with the changing technologies and the changing times. But its primary role as a kind of piece of architecture, civic, educational architecture, is held by the robustness that we build in now. The event center is also another volume which works by creating, again, another room, another vaulting space. And in it, we're able to have conference facilities, support facilities, and the sort of 300-room facility, which absolutely has a kind of large arching window to the water. So each of these forms have essentially 4 windows, 4 different arches on each form. And each arch frames a particular view, either creating transparency and relationships between themselves or framing views to the water or to the city or to the context. This is really just looking in more detail at how the event center works. So the pink is the event center. It's a main space. The patron spaces we're seeing and pre-function happen sort of on this area and are kind of working collectively with the library spaces, so they're visually connected and can interconnect with each other. And obviously the auditorium spaces here. And then, more cellular sort of conferencing spaces are also built into that, and the more open space facing the river at this side. And then there's a potential on the event center to make an upper event space, something that we looked at when we were placing the building, that there seemed to be a huge opportunity to make an extraordinary terrace, an upper Belvedere, that could be another event space that could allow incredible things to happen. I'll show you a sort of image of that view in a second. The podium will have planting and different things, sculpture, games, art, really a kind of an opportunity to really be programmed really beautifully. And then a sort of another outdoor auditorium which we want to kind of fold onto the water with a stage. So in a way there's an internal auditorium, but there's also an external auditorium. And you can imagine here concerts being performed, weddings being celebrated, events happening, and people generally just spending time here. And this is a kind of very large concourse which is going to be developed with landscape, but really become a special moment which rises onto the Belvedere. This is the view from the upper event space. It really gives you a kind of an extraordinary, kind of tranquil moment of seeing the water bodies and the landscaping working. And it really offers another opportunity, we think, in those sort of months where it's clement, the weather is good, and you can go up there and you can enjoy it. And it also has the opportunity to be able to create covered space, to be able to really make it an added bonus to the event center. That could be really powerful. Conceptually, so these geometries, these growing forms, this is looking from the water side. As I said, there are these different geometries that sort of have different scales and have these primary four windows, these arches that are different geometries depending on where and how the forms are made. They look as though they're straight, but they dip interior. So what happens is that the edges are straight, but it actually is concave, and we'll develop that on the inside, and creates the canopy curve that we're talking about. So it's really a very complicated geometry, which we'll speak about later as we develop it. But the waterfront edge, new bridges, the Belvedere, and then the library, the event center, maybe the upper event space, and the carport behind it. I'll just take you around it very quickly just to see the geometries. And this is really just trying to really talk about solid and void. We're at the very early stages. This is looking from the park side, the carport, the event center, that's upper space, and the library. So these three geometries, and that gives us opportunities to work on the materiality and the form to kind of create these three sort of beautiful, in a way, vaulting arches that land on 4 points structurally. So they're really also column-free. We're trying to make column-free spaces in the main sort of volume so that they're really these very elegant geometries that create the positioning. And then this is from the carport, from Morse Blvd. You will see these series of arches, gateways, almost like pavilions that announce that this is a very different context to the street context, but this is a kind of park, bucolic context, and these structural forms are inviting you to come in and to partake in the library services, the event center, and the view and the space. So this is looking from the side street where the long stay parking is, and looking at the sort of library and seeing the sort of library is the largest volume and its kind of primary window in the carport. And then really just a quick idea of what I was just saying about the sections, that essentially these are these structural forms. This is the event center room and the upper space. This is the space between the buildings and the incline. And then the idea that the library is this very vast hall with a sort of micro vaults in the upper level, but it's a volume within a volume that kind of creates this opportunity of having different qualities of spaces here and different qualities of spaces up above, but always being able to register the form and allowing us to develop an architecture for that form that is clear. This is just another view on the perimeters where you see the notion of the vault. This is just early days, but we're really starting to think about wanting to kind of develop this as the kind of motif and the idea of the building. These are just quick studies, but graphically, just assuming this is Morse Blvd, we're sort of talking about seeing a collection of volumes with maybe different tonalities, being able to arrive. The Belvedere is really flush at this point to allow access for everyone. There are no steps. You can walk straight onto it, and then, as it were, appears as a stage on the other side. You realize you've on this form. This is that space between the two buildings. So you come in between, from the carport, between these two buildings, and you're able to go to the event center and the library. And you can see the porosity and the way in which the windows create a dialogue. They're not opaque. They're transparent to each other. And the two communities can see each other. These are the patron spaces. These are the event center spaces and the patron spaces. And, we'll work on planting and vegetation, but this idea of making this incredible space which will make shade in the summer and protect you in the rain by being near the edge. A quick view, we're just in the early days of studying, but this is a moment where that auditorium we're seeing is not closed, but an open space where you get this fold, where you get seating area, but you also still get a window to the view. So at this point you can see out, but there could be a speaker, there could be a performance, there could be an education program happening in the space, and we think that could be a very powerful sort of fold in the space there. And then the edges, where really between sort of looking up and getting these incredible moments where you see what's happening up above and getting views out to the landscape, to nature. This is the sort of Belvedere, and being able to see different scales of spaces and the relationship to the park. And then the upper, more intimate spaces, again, sort of having these framing views through to the water. From the upper levels, you really look through the arches, and the arches focus your eye down onto the water. So you'll get these very mesmerizing kind of relationships in the upper levels with the children's library, etc., where they have this very privileged view of the water. And we're hoping that on certain kind of moments, the sun angles will start to bounce light into the volume to also create sort of optical and sort of light effects, which we think could be very powerful. And then we'll sort of accentuate that with also lights, zenithal lights, that will just highlight certain areas as we're deeper in the plan to create the luminosity that's important, but to create a kind of material quality and a light quality which allows for the different parts of the project to really be enjoyed at their maximum. The event center then becomes this extraordinary space, which for me, the most beautiful thing about those kinds of spaces that it almost feels like a tent for me. It's this very taut structure that it's not a enclosed room, but it feels like somebody's found the perfect position and placed a beautiful tent to frame the view and to enjoy the context, and then to create a kind of sort of powerful relationship to what you have. And it's this inside-outside relationship which I think is really powerful, the ability to have this event space and then spill out onto this terrace for more public things, maybe a side terrace for more private things, or to rise up, finish the night up above. Could be a very powerful way of enjoying that spatially. And sort of, an ending, something starting to approach a sort of a relationship to the water, a network of paths that come next to the building, these 3 volumes, and the way in which they create the relationship to the bodies of water and to the context. We're very sort of keen that this podium really kind of services and becomes the kind of glue between all 3 parts, and it helps us with our servicing and the systems. This is where we've got to so far, and this is sort of where we wanted to kind of come and speak to you and to sort of get a response. And, what we are talking about is to really think about, where we are in this time in the 21st century. We want to be very sustainable. We want to use plant-based textiles. We want to bring nature in. We want to use zero-carbon timber, which is very important for a lot of the details. We know that the technology, we want to kind of encourage augmented reality, virtual reality, and even artificial intelligence right in the core of the way in which the library office services, that these are in the maker spaces, etc., and that we maximize the views, the power of the water, and the sort of masonry architecture to perform as much as possible to give the project the best that we can. Thank you.
I'm sorry you have to go from that eloquence to me. And let's admit it, who knew what a Belvedere was before this? I remember the TV show Mr. Belvedere, but that's as far as I got. So now it's our opportunity to, what I'd like to do is at least have each commissioner, if you have specific questions or if you'd like to address any comments, I think now would be the time to that before we open it up to the public. I know it's a little bit unusual to speak in front of this size, but Mr. Weldon, please. I think we have a microphone for you if you have any questions for the design team, and we'll kind of go down the line.
Try it now. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. As you guys know, we had a slight advance preview of this, and I have to acknowledge that I'm very impressed with the concept. The things that I iterated to Russell, I'll just repeat here in terms of what I think are some of the priorities of Winter Park with regard to this structure or these structures. And that is the quality of the materials and the long-lived sense of timelessness combined with function. I would like to see as a commissioner, and I think the public will be well served by those priorities.
Commissioner Seidel.
Thank you, and I too thought it was an excellent presentation. It's kind of uplifting when I hear you talk about a building and there's so many parts of it I normally don't think about. So thank you for that. Thank you for the education here. My questions are more on the engineering side, as one might suspect. And these large windows, as you know, we have hurricanes here, and I didn't really see any structural support on those. And I was wondering if that's something you guys have thought about yet, and how those windows might actually function. We wouldn't need to put plywood on them in the hurricane, would we? That's why.
Is there anybody that want to address it, or I would assume that that's going to be?
I can take that. Yeah. No. We're simply at concept. There are going to be hurricane withstanding window mullions, and we want to kind of make that. It's at the moment I'm trying to create the emphasis on the inside-outside relationship. And if I start to draw mullions, your eye goes to that first. So I'm trying to get the fundamentals set, and then as we develop it in the next set of details, you'll see the structure come through. But those arches are also helped by those mullions. So there's a kind of structural performance that they're also going to add. So, excellent.
Thank you. Commissioner Cooper.
Yes, I just want to say how very much I appreciate the thought that has gone into this and the understanding of our community. Before I ever saw what you drew, I read what you said. And what you said is that we have had good history and we have had hard history, and that you will immerse yourself in that history before you ever put your pen to paper. And I want to tell you that means a great deal to this community, because this, as you said, is not a library for someone. It's a library for everyone. And I am just thrilled with what I see. I know you mentioned tonality. So one of my questions would be, will that come from color or material?
Yes.
And another question, like Greg, my concern was the operations and maintenance cost of all of the glass. We have to think ahead for that. We aren't a huge city, and most of us would prefer not to become a huge city in order to pay our bills.
Yes.
And lastly, I would say safety, relative to the water, relative to the Belvedere.
Yes.
And I think that's what touched me most, was the thought that you're putting into this. How could we possibly be more blessed than to have you here? And we appreciate that. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Something that I'm completely committed to is that the act of making architecture, we have limits in our budgets, etc., but that we do the best that we can in terms of sustainability and material architecture. For me, you can see that I'm hinting at it. Materiality is something that I'm obsessed and love, and I want to make the building, in a way that doesn't have. I want it to be as maintenance-free as possible, because in a way, for me, that the model is the monastery. There it is built, and it gets loved generations later because the materials were correct, the responses were correct, and it becomes an icon over time. And that's the ambition I have for your building. So I'm not interested in sort of plastering or anything like that. I'm interested, which kind of require maintenance. And I'm thinking, how can we make a material presence that actually has a kind of integrity in its own self and can age with dignity. And then the tonality is something that I'm, working with. Tonality is to do with the perception of light and place. But also when you're making aggregate forms, there's also relationships. And so that's a lot of testing. And to be honest, I don't have the answers yet. So I want to see lots of samples. We're going to put them in the sun. I want to see how they fade or not, how they react. We know some of the science behind it, but I think that's the enjoyment of the design that we want to get into later. Sort of test things and see how they perform, and make the right choices, because you make the choice now, and that's the building built. So we're on the same page, I think.
Commissioner Sprinkle.
Well, each of us brings something different to our commission, and we got the engineer, the businessman, and I'm the touchy-feely one, okay? So I'll tell you that when you were talking, I felt like you knew me. I felt like you knew my neighbors. I felt like you've heard from them. I felt like you've been in Winter Park a lot, and that in being in Winter Park, you knew what we wanted. And while I'm sitting here, I'm a teacher. I couldn't draw that. I don't know how to do that, but I know how I felt when I saw what you drew. I know what I felt when I went into the building. And that's all I can ask for. You bring that to our community, and our community is very blessed to have you and all of your team doing what you're doing for us. So thank you. But one word, I have a question for him. I know that when I see a building I like, I go, wow, wow. What do you want our people to say when they see your building? It's our building, but what do you want them to say when you see that building?
I want the community to say, that's our building.
Thank you.
That's really what I want the community to say. It's all of our building. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you all. I just have 2 points. One, I don't know if many of you know, but Sir David was just chosen to design the new Holocaust memorial in Westminster, right next to the Houses of Parliament, which is obviously a very big deal. And researching it, the research that went into that assignment, again, is a big deal. And I think just listening to the team talk about how they researched and the depth that they've gone to on here, I have no doubt that this building will not only withstand hurricane force winds, but it will address some of the rain and some of the weather issues we have here in the city of Winter Park. And we talked about this originally when we first discussed this, that this project has to be of the park, and not just sitting in the park and not just fronting the park. And the way that you worked the trails in and addressed the fields and all the different things really was impressive to me. And one of the other questions for me has always been, I want people to drive up to that building and say, wow, look at this thing. And then I want the people walking out of those buildings saying to them, you should see the inside. And so that's what I'm looking for. As beautiful as you do the outside, it needs to perform for us, not just from an aesthetic standpoint inside, but from the functions of this community and those that utilize this project, because I think it will be a real benefit to this community for generations to come. So thank you for your attentiveness to all the detail that you've presented so far. Folks, the one thing I left out was timing that I did not address earlier, and I meant to address this because some people are saying, besides the timeline that Mauricio shared with us earlier, the City Commission will be voting on this on November 13th, whether we proceed or not with this project. So that is our next regularly scheduled meeting, and we would love your input prior to that. The construction manager at risk will be at the November 13th meeting, and we'll also choose then. If approved, the concept design is refined to final design, beginning to fine-tune details and working towards construction documents. And the last booking, so everybody is aware of this building, is June 28th of 2018. So we've that is our deadline to make a decision, because we've stopped taking bookings on this building, thinking that we will be proceeding at around that time. And project completion, as you've seen, was estimated to be spring of 2020. Okay, with that, do we have comments we have cards, Brenda? Would someone bring me those, please? And I feel like Monty Hall up here. Thank you. Okay, here's a really interesting question, Sir David. Regarding the podium, there's a thought that if you're having to step up to the podium, maybe perhaps you're not feeling welcome. You're not kind of going in at ground level, if that's a thought. Can you kind of this idea of a stage or a Belvedere, yeah. Russell's favorite word. Can you kind of address that thought, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So what we deliberately made sure we didn't want is that people approach something that you have to rise up to. So from the boulevard side, it's absolutely level with the street and the ground plane. You walk straight onto it. And what it does is that because the ground falls away, when you get to the edge of the Belvedere, you realize that you have this vantage point over the water spaces. And then we bring other systems up, like ramps and stairs up to the podium if you're coming from the park side, acknowledging that most people that are coming through the park side are either just using the paths to get to destinations, and most people coming to the library are coming from the boulevard side. So from the boulevard side, from the community, from able to disabled, we want it to be absolutely equal in terms of the kind of relationship and the empowerment that you have about entering the building. That's something very important to the way we're working.
Okay. And can you address that from a handicap standpoint too? We do
Yes.
have a lot of seniors in here who have
Yes.
access issues.
It's the entire building is absolutely disabled friendly. As I said, the entrance area is absolutely flush, so that anyone pulling up or walking can absolutely go level onto the podium, and it's only at this moment from the paths that you realize that there's an upper and lower stage. And that's a way to kind of, allow this area to become that civic community stage that overlooks it, but allows the park users to also have their routes. And they're invited to come up if they wish to come up through the building.
Thank you. And I apologize if you answered that at first. I was reading the next question as you were answering. There is a question here about a test kitchen that was discussed as possibly one of the programming opportunities or one of the facility opportunities for the project, and I think that's probably something that we'll be talking through as we move forward with design. Mm-hmm. I have a question here. Compared with the existing library space, how much space will the new library provide?
Russell.
No, speaking to my neck?
Speak through that.
Try that one.
Yeah, so the question was...
The existing
Size.
library space is roughly 30,000 square feet?
Yeah, so the new library is 34,000. That's about 20,000 all on the ground floor for the adult collection, the teen, the material handlers, and then 14,000 up for the children and administration.
I think for those that are unaware, the existing space, the children's space in the library is one of the most heavily used, but is one of the smallest spaces. So I think they're addressing that in this design too, to really take advantage of the youth that utilize the library. Another question here. The relationship, I can answer this, the relationship between the Aspen Institute work done in the library on this design. I think, as Russell mentioned, the team was down here during the initial conversations with the Aspen Institute, but do you want to touch on how that interacted with your work?
Yes, there we go. Yeah, so basically taking, while we're here and listening, like reconnaissance, gathering intelligence, what you start to see with some of that green zone that we talk about, that's one of the, I'd say, new amenities to the library space that you don't currently see now. And that's the idea of future growth of new programming, to be programmed, maybe not so specific that is known today, but things that can evolve. And I think that came out of the Aspen Institute of a question of how is it the center of lifelong learning. And that's our goal, is that those green zones start to take on not necessarily children today or not necessarily adult today, but it's going to ebb and flow with the library program as we move forward.
Thank you, Russell. Just a few comments on the direction. I love the direction. Our current library has little opportunity to use those outdoor spaces. Having the water visible and accessible by paths is wonderful. Also loving that you're taking into account the need for shade, especially in the summer months. Someone's telling you need bigger fonts in your next presentation.
Roger.
Regarding shading for the large windows and sunrise, we do have fairly powerful sunrise and sunsets. I would assume that when you're looking at those beautiful scapes that you discuss, we'll be just talking about how that's shaded. Does the new library, in your feeling, in your perspective, create a new architectural vision for Winter Park? I think the question is, you discussed those earlier architectural styles from our history, and I know that was a thought as how you got into where you ended up. But do you think we're setting a new architectural design, or how would you answer that, David?
I would answer that by saying that we are learning from the past and creating a form that understands the past, but is resolutely about a modern topology. And I'm hoping that what it's doing is to really present a civic architecture, a model of a modern civic architecture for the community, but one that is rooted in understanding the narratives of the history of the place. The sort of early conversations about how you create a base, shade, and form really are the DNA sort of things that we really learned and looked at very specifically. And this idea of, what happened in the mid-20th century with new industrial materials, steel and concrete that Frank Lloyd Wright and all the other architects were using, also trying to understand and learn how to use structure in this climate and to create an architecture that marries those two worlds, the sort of engineering excellence of the mid-century, the sort of intelligence of the vernacular architecture and the roots of the history, into a new 21st century architecture, which should feel, I hope, my wish is that the building really feels at once somehow familiar, but also incredibly new.
There's other questions in here regarding the lighting and how the light plays off of those windows. So obviously I think I know personally someone who wanted to open up a restaurant down here, and for him having an outdoor space was incredibly important. And I think everybody that lives down here says, well, that's great about 3 months of the year, but August lasts 6 months of the year. So I think there's very real concern about the glass and how that's handled and the heat loss. I did have a question here what is the thought behind not connecting the buildings? You talked about the 3 different structures.
Yes.
And when we originally discussed the concept of building these together, the thought was borrowed space and how do the spaces interact, because a library is mostly used 9 to 5 and an event center the majority of the time is after that. So how do we get the efficiencies of this space, not just from an operational standpoint, because we have discussed that too. Obviously we have 2 fairly inefficient buildings now that we're replacing with this new one. And so what was the thinking behind 3 buildings or 3 structures versus 2 or 1?
So the thinking was that really some of the kind of powerful things about being here is the ability to have inside-outside space. And if we were just trying to aggregate everything into one volume, it would become a very interiorized building. And what I mean by that is that there would be rooms that would be deep in the plan, and we would be spending a lot of time trying to make them as best as we can. And what we thought was that could we make the buildings feel like more light, more pavilion-like, more sort of in a way for me the architecture is somehow somewhere between the urban grid of the city and urban buildings and the park with its open structures. It's sort of halfway between those two. So if you imagine like the bandstand structure or a little loggia garden structure in the park, this is a sort of between that and an office building is where we're sort of at. It's sort of an enclosed version of that. So really trying to make sure that the building is acknowledging that we're in a landscape and that we're able to enjoy it and we're not close to it and not making too much sort of interiority, but always creating that relationship. And then really making sure that then the building doesn't have any rigid sense of, how people should use it. So I've sort of resisted trying to make sort of specific walkways, but to try and actually make the architecture do as much as it can so that people feel the sense of being able to kind of make their own choices, but they're not too led by the architecture. So the idea for me is that the podium really becomes this collective space that you might just want to come and read a book and just sit outside, but actually not go to the library and just enjoy the view, but not necessarily be down at the park and just use it like that. And that is important, that this space is convivial to every kind of whim of publicness that you want to have that's different to your sort of home life. So you can just come and spend time, come and talk to your children, schools can meet and just be on the terrace. You can use the library, you can use the event center, you can use the upper level. It really becomes a kind of a way to maximize all that we can give in terms of an outdoor public space that serves the community. And really that's the ambition, I think, because that then creates the incredible cross-pollination, the learning, the sort of tolerance and understanding of different groups and different ages, and also creates the kind of continuity about what the community spirit is and the identity of the community as it moves forward. The building sort of helps to become an agent to put those things together. And somehow, I sort of liked the idea that the three buildings, they are very different in terms of their program, but somehow I wanted to make them one family. It's a kind of family still life, right? It's like they're all the same, but they do different things. Right.
I'm loving what I'm hearing tonight. That's a nice comment. I think that's interesting. In light of the trends in library design emphasizing expanded programs and increased technology emphasis, and as the city we are dealing with some technology opportunities. Can you comment on the importance of traditional spaces of silence and enclosure? One of the things we heard from the library task force originally was this is not going to be the library that we all grew up with. As libraries are different now, so how do we walk that balance of providing those spaces for those that still utilize the library that way?
Yeah, I mean, a community library isn't a hush space library. That's an academic library, a university library. A community library is a place where the community is actively using it, and there are spaces to retreat and work, but the kind of main feeling is much more lively than a sort of hushed academic space. So I think that there's that to fully understand. I mean, it's not going to be a space where you can't hear yourself. It's not going to be overly loud. We're really being sensitive about the materiality of it so that we're absorbing sound as much as possible in terms of the way in which we're organizing the architecture. But we want it to be a space where, in terms of legibility, because it's so many people coming to it, I want the space to have a very easy legibility, that it doesn't feel like you need to go down that corridor to go up that stair, to go around that thing, to get to that room. It's got to feel like you want the teenage space, it's just there. You want to go to that, it's just there. It's not, the building reads very easily, and it feels almost too simple. And that's, I think, when it's successful. When it sort of becomes complicated and you're putting lots of graphic signs everywhere about up, down, round, for me, that's when a building is in trouble. So I'm trying to make it reduced and as very kind of clear in its legibility as I possibly can. So the things are not hidden. Have you seen, we try not to make floors that go across, but actually always being able to see up above, or for the people up above to see below, and things like that.
Questions. There was a couple questions in here regarding the flexibility of the event center space. I think you originally showed 2 rooms, but can you address that? I think there was discussion whether it's one big room that can be divided.
Yeah. Are we on? Yeah. So as part of the programming exercise, we determined that it's one large space by using the whole campus, as it were. We have that ability to use smaller scale spaces throughout, maybe the library side or the junior ballroom, but basically the 300-seat banquet hall is not divided. It's a full 300-seat with stage.
Another question that came out of that was regarding parking capacity, and I can tell you that is something I think every commission member and staff had some concerns with, and we're working through. I think that's the one challenge that probably can't be answered here this evening. We're going to be looking at a couple of different ways to address that, and that's why I believe the design team showed all the excess capacity around the neighborhood for if we are probably hitting max capacity for both buildings at the same time. It's going to be in the evening when the majority of the adjoining neighboring properties will be empty. So that's something we're working through. Is there anything you'd like to touch on parking, Russell? No? Okay. Thanks for leaving me hanging out there on that one. Russell gets to get back on a plane tonight. That was the parking. There's a question, and I think it's got to do with your reference to the historical section on here. And we do have some historical museums through the city. We have the library itself has a number of older signs and things like that they'd like to. Can you talk about what that space, how you envision that space, and is it a participatory space with some of the museums? Was that the thinking behind it that was flexible enough?
Yeah, the idea is that it's holding one of the anchoring corner points of the library, and it's off the community table or the Belvedere, and that's basically, yeah, thank you. That's the corner we're looking at, and the idea there is that on the public-facing side, that is where you have your interactive kiosk reading rooms, and it's more of the open, and then behind that is the support of the climate-controlled storage.
I don't know what a well-certified facility is, but it says, given the amount of time residents, patrons, and employees will be spending in the new facility, is the city architect or designer considering making the building a well-certified facility?
I can say that we are going to meet LEED criteria. We're not going for a full LEED plaque on the wall, but we will be meeting LEED at a minimum.
You went to school longer than I did, so I'm glad you were able to answer that question. There's a lot of questions, folks, and I think we're regarding programming and on the lake, specifically kayaking, canoeing. Will we be incorporating that? I think that's something we'll probably be working on through the city and thinking of how we're going to address that. It's not going to be me. Yeah, but it's certainly, I think, as they have viewed this is a very holistic approach to this park. And I think that whatever we do outside is going to affect the inside, and whatever is done inside will hopefully interact with the outside. That is the plan. You have a city and a commission that's committed to that. There's programming issues. Will the community rooms be open? Still, we haven't discussed that, but I would assume there will be flexibility in that. Outstanding design. Now, this is, Russell, you're going to use your college on this one. How did you use the idea of library topology to inform your design approach and process? Did you?
I think that's order, David.
David asked you to answer that question.
That's my education.
Absolutely. We are very much sort of analyzers of library topologies, and I made the comment about this as a community library, which is a very different kind of topology. Community libraries don't have the sort of august history as academic libraries, which can go back, 1,000 years in our the history of civilization, 1,000 or even more. And that has a specific kind of quality and category. Really, community libraries are really a 20th century phenomena, and they really are, from the sort of the idea of moving Encyclopedia Britannica into a community space that everybody could get access to, and then updating it, and then the explosion of sort of these sort of printed matter sort of post-war becoming the kind of space in which people could actually go and read papers, read things like that. So community libraries are a very different type. So their typology as a built form is a weaker one than the sort of traditional august sort of academic library. And they're really coming into their own now as we understand the community library as really a social space of education. It's a socialized educational space. And so the topology of that is something that we're evolving, and I think this building now starts to add to that category, especially in sort of this kind of community, this kind of geography, this kind of climate. I hope that helps you understand what we're trying to say.
Okay, we have a question regarding height of the buildings, and I think that I know they're all three different heights as currently concepted, but I think the challenge we face here in Winter Park is a three-story building on this site is different than a three-story site downtown. So can you talk about the height in feet and also how it plays in the environment that it sits?
Right. I'll leave the scale to David, but I'll give the technical that each of them we're meeting the zoning, current zoning, keeping it under 2 stories, and that's what you saw in the main library. And that basically then, as David mentioned, as a family, it's small, medium, and large, working with the entry drop-off, the event center, and the library.
So specifically, do you have that, when we look at the library, what height with that parapet walls?
Off the top of my head, I'm going to say it's 34 feet off the average datum of Morse Blvd for the length of our building.
Okay. And then the library or the event center is a few feet below that?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. David, can you talk about how the height plays with the, because again, when somebody hears 35 feet, they may think, oh my gosh, that's gigantic. Oh. In the right context, that may not be so. Can you talk about how that plays in this area?
Yeah. What I wanted to do also was not to have the building feel like it's 3 stories or 2 stories, that it's a single form. So in a way, with a landscape with lots of trees, when you have single forms, it then is much more relational than actually when you sort of can register plates and architecture. So I think that what you'll see is that the building is in sympathy with the landscape, with the trees and the landscape, and the geometries, the heights actually will sort of just not be a single line, but the stepping down to, the entry level, almost as it were, stepping down to you as you arrive, and then rising to the landscape as you move through it, is just part of the sort of dynamic that we think will allow the forms to not feel too big, too monolithic, but to allow them to break and to be seen in perspective. Also, the arrangement of them is not orthogonal to each other. They're not sort of rigid. They're actually very playful. And one of the reasons for that is that you're always seeing the building from each elevation in a 3/4 view. So you're never getting it flat. You're always getting sort of 3/4 views. And that also helps with the way in which you break down the mass, that you see this collection of forms in different ways, but never just flat, always in always in 3 dimensions, I'm saying. And that's something that's very important to the way in which I wanted the building to work, that in the landscape, it's not a huge monolithic block that's at the end, but it's actually a series of pavilions that are weaving with the landscape to create the form. So I actually think that it's actually not going to feel, it's actually going to feel very gentle in its presence, especially with the trees around it.
Okay. We have a question here. Will Lake Killarney be visible from the roof of the event center as well as the park? Oh, yeah. And, I'm not sure. It looks like we're going to have the library will not have roof access, but the library will be impeding the view towards Lake Killarney, right? Okay. See, I jumped in on the architecture question there. There are some questions, and I think one of the overriding themes that I'm seeing here are questions about sensitivity to the history of design in Winter Park. And there are some concerns from people in here that this doesn't necessarily, from a conceptual drawing, feel as if it's true. Now, again, there's a few questions out of a population of 29,000. I know we're sensitive to design in the city of Winter Park, but I think that's something you've already addressed, but I think I want to raise it again as some have raised that concern. So.
No, this is not a building which is sort of mimicking what has already been done. This is definitely a building that is taking another step and definitely learning the lessons. Absolutely want to learn lessons. It would be, folly to not do that. But this is a building that's trying to establish another sort of pearl in the garland of types of buildings that you have. And we see that the relationship between the event center and the library and this spot allows us to kind of maybe produce another kind of architecture. This kind of site is not everywhere in your city as a public infrastructure. So we think that that allows an opportunity to do something that adds to what you have. So we were absolutely, some of the early discussions in the team was, learning the lessons, understanding the materiality. I remember we talked about certain materiality issues, certain ways in which buildings are made here. But we wanted to make something more than that. And I think that's the benefit of having a team like us come in, is that we push you and our local team, your local team helps us to understand the issues, and together we'll hopefully make something that is magical and adds richness to your landscape of built form.
Folks, I should have said this before. All of these that you've supplied tonight, they will be going back with the team. So they will have each individual comment. If you don't feel yours was addressed tonight, they will be looking at it. Hopefully, I've tried to consolidate some of the ones that I thought were close. Some of the concerns, I think Commissioner Seidel brought up one of his, as an engineer, he has some concerns about things. And there's a question here about stormwater treatment concept. This will not be built if it does not meet our code. So and I think Commissioner Seidel would even know that it will not, these buildings do not get put up unless they meet certain structures, specifically hurricane, stormwater, those types of things. And there again is questions about computer research use. Yes, there will be technology involved in this project when it's completed. Those are all the questions I have. I'll open it back up to the commission before I turn it over to the staff or to the public for any other questions.
Thank you, and thank you for all your answers. One thought came to my mind as you kept talking about these great views that we have. And as you may or may not be aware, we have recently done a park study, and we're looking to do some things within the park itself. What I would want to know is, what should we not do? You don't have to answer right now. What should we not do that could mess up these wonderful views that we're going to have out these windows? So as that park study moves forward, that we're not doing something that's going to not be in equilibrium with what you're doing.
That's great to have the synergy to think through that, because in a way we sort of feel like we're sort of adding the last piece of sort of built infrastructure, and then really how that affects the way the improvements are happening then becomes something that has to be coordinated so that everything's being enhanced together. Yeah.
Commissioner Cooper?
And last thoughts, budget, stormwater.
Architects don't like to answer that question.
And appreciation. Thank you.
No? Okay, folks, we have some extra time here. If there's any other questions, anybody, do you want to set up a mic out in the middle?
I can.
Mauricio?
I was just going to address budget real quick.
Sure.
Since you gave me the hard question, we take. Can you listen?
There you are. You're on. You're on.
I'm on.
You're hot.
I'm on. Okay. We take budget very seriously, and it's been a pleasure working with Adjaye Associates because they do too. When we first started, our first pass was slightly over budget, and we've been able to sort of pare the project down to where we can present today a project where the base is within the budget. So be assured of that. We do have some enhancements that are above the current budget, but that's something that we're going to present to you in the future and see if there's some additional funds, then those enhancements could be implemented. But the project as a base is within.
As presented, as we look at that, is presented to the residents today.
Correct. There are two enhancements that I'd like to point out that are outside of the budget. One is the rooftop cafe, and then the other enhancement would be the outdoor auditorium. But everything else is within what we'll be bonding.
Okay.
It's also fair to mention that those were outside of the originally specified
That's
scope
correct.
of the project. So basically,
Yep.
the community weighed into some wants, and we implemented into the base or to the design in hopes to.
So I'm sorry, would you introduce yourself, please? Because I think that it's important that the people understand the perspective that you're bringing.
Carlo Burns with Pasuti, your owner's rep. So we're also very conscious of cost as well. That's our primary charge. So one of the things that happened is that the community basically asked for some extra amenities that weren't originally programmed as part of the base program. And the design team basically acknowledged those difficulties and those budgetary constraints. And we're bidding those as ad alternates, hoping to take advantage of positive bidding and maybe donation opportunities to provide you the bigger, better program that was actually outside or a little bit above the originally specified scope of the work. In other words, we're just trying to give you as much bang for the buck as we can.
Thank you, Carlo. Daniel, we have, how should we handle this, Clarissa?
Yeah,
Daniel, can you move that to the middle for me, Clarissa?
First of all, you don't need any of us to tell you, but nice work.
Thank you.
Very nice work. Winter Park is home to the Morse Museum that has the largest collection of Tiffany glass in the world.
Yes.
Much of it, in fact, most of it, is typically in storage. If some accommodation could be made to incorporate it, sounds like you're thinking about that. That's wonderful. The one other thing I would say is that as much as I like it, and this is obviously not a criticism, but a closer dialogue between actually being able to sit on the water, to be near the water, would be something that would be terrific. Central Florida has an enormous number of lakes, very, very few opportunities to sit, to eat, to dine. If the cafe were involved in some way close with a dialogue with the water, that would be great. Anyway, thank you so much.
Sir David, I believe your wife is here. It says we are blessed to have Sir David Adjaye to design the library. So I think she's hiding out here. So just a very nice compliment of the design and your efforts. Sir, would you come up to the microphone? You can just, if anybody would like to line up to the microphone, that would be helpful. Thank you.
So I very much appreciate you looking to the future in your design. I think we do need to look forward, not backwards. I agree completely with that. The one comment I really have is the answer about space. Because if we're looking to the future, you're hardly expanding the usable space as a library. Now, I understand the concept of community, but this is also a functional library. And you seem to be making a very small expansion in the opportunity for the functional aspect of the library. And as we look to the future, this building is going to be here for 50 years, maybe longer. Are you really allowing enough space to accommodate its usability going forward into the future? And yes, we're going to go away from paper, but we will still have a paper-based library as well as the electronic functions that get put in place. So I'd really ask you to think about, are you allowing enough space to really make the library work as a library?
We can both answer that. I think there's been a lot of focus on exactly what that question and what we need. And I think that the consensus between all the stakeholders has brought us to this position. And then about the nature of growth. Growth doesn't necessarily mean bigger. Growth is really the way in which technology transforms the way in which some of the bulk that's stored in the building, happens. But you're absolutely right. Books are not going away. In fact, they become rarer and rarer and more precious in communities. So there are certain books that will always stay, but then other things will evolve. The way we listen, the way we kind of read certain matter will change. And we're trying to make a building which can be robust enough to deal with that. I think sort of late 20th century buildings try to do it by making raised floors and all these sort of things, but made terrible spaces mostly. And that's kind of one of the buildings that you have at the moment. It was actually planned as a flexible modern building, And what we're trying to do is learn those lessons to make great spaces for the community that have the kind of range and capability to allow for the evolving of technology, but also the kind of core idea of being able to kind of have a book, have a view, have a seat, have a place. That is kind of fundamentally the basic diagram in the building, that it allows that basic thing to happen. And unless if you're going to have a population explosion and triple, which is not something we're planning for, we think that that fundamental human quality of the relationship to the book is something that we want to design into this building, and then to allow enough flexibility that whatever evolving technology that happens can be easily accommodated without sort of ruining the building or destroying the core fundamentals of it.
I think the one thing I'd like to add is that, as David's mentioned, with growth, not always does that mean bigger. And one of the key principles we've done in the design is try to, as David said, we're trying to go structure-free, column-free on the inside of the event center. Inside the library, we're trying to keep down to basically 4 core legs, as I'll call them, that provide the bones of the building for now and the future. So as those spaces adapt to the change that might come with program, and as that's discovered and as we evolve, the idea is the bones are there, and the rest of the floor plate is rather open to change.
Jeffrey.
Thank you very much. The design is brilliant.
Thank you.
Two questions. They're primarily, I think, towards programming. The first is on parking. It had been my understanding that there was a parking garage in this originally to take care of capacity. If that's gone, does that mean that the budget for a parking garage is now in the project and not for parking? I hope so, because that would be really cool. That relies on shared parking, and is that the scheme, that shared parking is going to mean we don't have to have a parking garage?
You want me to take that?
Yes, you should. The mayoral.
Well, you guys are going to get on the plane, so I got to watch out what you say, because they're going to call me. I think another way to look at the budget and the way the budget stands today is perhaps that parking garage is what made that budget above budget in the first place. So while that has not been put back into the budget itself for the library and event center, it's no longer taking away from that budget as well. And regarding shared parking, that's something, again, we're working through, and the team is working through. I think there's probably opportunities with surrounding property owners that we're looking at, so we don't necessarily maybe have to have parking out front. And there's also opportunities for fundraising efforts to provide maybe some additional parking underground that might allow us to handle that without impacting the aesthetic of the structure itself.
That's great precedent for future projects. On the other question is on the event center. It's a beautiful building, but basically we're taking the same function and putting in a new skin. This is just a personal observation that we have a need for a variety of event spaces of different sizes, of different uses, for different kinds of workshops, for design workshops, and those kinds of spaces don't exist in this community. If we're just going to replace it with the same thing that we have now in terms of a 300-seat ballroom, is that something that and that's not so much an architectural question. This is a city question. Is this what we want? Or, because this is the time to decide that, because I think there's a lot more types of spaces that we need in addition to this type of space.
So I'll let these guys off on this one as well. I will tell you that the original design and the original discussion with them, and I think it's, as Sir David was discussing, to look at each individual building in a vacuum is probably not the way to go about this. I do think the Civic Center being replaced with a building of similar structure and similar size is an interesting position, but when you think about the rooftop, the opportunity for a rooftop venue, it is a new space, and it is a space that can be utilized not only differently, but in concert with the space below it. And also at night when the library space clears out, there's an opportunity, because of the way the roof's overhang and the way the interplay between the two structures, that this space can be used as well, because if people are not going to be in there using it for library functions, that opens up another opportunity for a space for us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Now, that was an architect asking, so I can't wait he's going to give me feedback on my architectural responses, right, Jeff?
My name is Lurleen Fletcher, and I live in the area. And my concern...
I'm going to lower this for you, Laura.
Okay.
There we go.
I was trying to see which way to turn it.
I didn't want you to.
Okay, my name is Lurleen Fletcher, and I live in the area. I have a lot of big concerns, but I wanted to know about the lake that you all talking about, the 3-part lake. You know, those are mostly sinkholes, and when you get ready to work on them, are you going to extend those lakes, what you all are calling lakes? Are you extending them? Are they going to be larger than what they are now?
Thank you, Lurleen. I'll ask, from an engineering standpoint, have you all looked at the size of the lakes? That's for you, Russell. I'm not answering that one.
Thanks for that. We are not extending those lakes. We are trying to embrace and get down at the water's edge here. We recognize it as one lake, but sort of 3 bodies of water, with the paths kind of creating those 3 bodies of water. We recognize it's one lake. We also know that it was at one point a garbage dump. That thankfully has changed.
Yeah.
Yes, sure.
And then another question I needed to ask you. Those square boxes in the back there, what are those? All the way in the back, the white ones.
Oh. Those are just buildings.
Oh, those are the buildings across the street.
Those are existing buildings. So
okay,
they're buildings.
then. All right, then. And then I heard you said something about the height of the building. I didn't quite get it. So is it going to be a 3-story, 2-story, or just going to be a single story?
Inside it's a 2-story building on the left, and it's 2 code right now. It's currently meeting code.
Okay. And the parking garage?
There is no parking garage.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now.
That's my main concern, is because the west side is having nothing but parking garage on it, and it's getting to be a little bit too much of cars running in and out. And I would like for you to have when they come off on Morse Blvd, to make sure they don't come in through my community. 'Cause I live right down the street. And I just can't get off of Dennis, and I don't tell anybody what y'all finna do with Dennis, because I don't like that either. Okay, thank you.
All right, Ms. Fletcher, thank you. Ms. Schatz.
Yes, I obviously am confused now, because I went to all the task force meetings and was aware of the original ideas with the parking garage and the parking, which I had a little bit of concern about with all the seniors we have in the community. So now I guess I'm hearing we don't have a parking garage. So what is the big structure? Is that parking underneath that structure? And I'm really concerned as you're saying, well, you know, we might not have the capacity that we need, and we'll be looking at neighborhoods availability. Well,
so can I address that, Ms.
all of this is something new that I think needs to be really discussed thoroughly with the public, because there was a lot of concern about how you're going to get to the event center in your high heels if you're young, not like me, and if there's going to be plenty of handicap parking and senior parking so that people don't have to drop you off in front of the event center and then go park a half a mile away if your husband is also a senior. So I think some clarification on the parking needs to be given to us now.
Ms. Schatz, just so you understand, that parking to the left is still considered a structure. It's just not a raised structure, so you're aware. So when people talk that it's a structure, a parking lot is still considered a structure. Currently, all the parking is handled on site on the flat lot that's drawn into the diagram.
So we're actually going to be
going
in and parking underneath the building?
No, it's on grade. It's currently what's out there now, but expanded and better utilized.
Oh, but it's just going to have a structure over it?
There's no raised. Sorry.
So there's just a structure around it to give the illusion of a structure?
The way
I'm
things
sorry.
are, I don't want you to get hung up on the word structure. And maybe I did that to you, and I apologize if I did. And I'm sure I'm going to get an email tomorrow from you. But I think what we're trying to say is what you see, Russell will do it.
What you're seeing here is the parking structure off to the side. It's basically
Parking lot.
it's a parking,
parking
it's
lot.
surface parking,
Okay.
and it by planning and zoning, there's a requirement for about 149 cars, and we're trying to provide 220 on site. So
And
above and
is there
beyond.
something around the parking lot for the visual?
That has not gotten to that point yet. We're just trying to get the numbers right now. Okay, but again, I don't want you to get hung.
Where's the third structure? Third structure, if it's not the parking lot?
The portico, the event center, and the library. Those are the three structures that play together that Sir David was talking about.
Okay.
It's a covered drop-off.
Okay. Any other questions? No? Anything? Okay. Go ahead, David.
No, I think that...
One more?
Sure, Stephen.
I can't wait to sit on the table in rocking chairs and look over the lake.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
David, do you want to say anything before?
Oh, please.
Several years ago, when we first started discussing the need of a new library, they said that the current library needed to be rewired and replumbed. Now, in a few years, will this new structure need to be rewired and replumbed?
Hopefully not. No. In a few years, we'll just be completing it.
What about in 20 years?
Well, hopefully in 20 years, it should need rewiring because the technology would have changed. But the fundamental bones will be absolutely there. I mean, what we don't know is how buildings are changing so fast, and none of us can predict exactly which route is going to be there, but we're building in as much intelligence as we can so that you don't have to tear down this building to do it again. We want to kind of allow it to be very adaptable and flexible. So we're hoping that this building will be here 100 years.
So it would be accessible for rewiring and replumbing?
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
very good.
Yeah. Can I just say that it's been an extraordinary sort of few months already just working with this community and working with the stakeholders and working with the city and our partners, and we are so thrilled and enjoying this process very much. Criticism is very important, and it's very important to hear the comments, good and positive, because that makes the project better, and we listen. We're here to listen. You know, I always tell my team, our first job is to not draw too fast, but to listen and to try and incorporate as much as we can within the limits that we've been given to produce the best that we can. We really take this idea of being public servants to building something for communities very seriously. So we appreciate your comments and your attention, and we hope we can have your support to deliver something that's a world-class building for you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here tonight. Fellow Commission members, David, Mauricio, and Russell, thank you all. We are adjourned for the evening. Thank you all.